For many of you this evening, after I share my hopefully brief message, yes, I did smirk when I said that. No, we're going to try and make it brief. I hope that the reaction is, yes, Pastor Frank, we know that. That's kind of the reaction that I'm looking for, actually. And I don't doubt that it will come, because I know that you're all well-rounded and well-balanced. But I've seen much confusion in the church recently. The unrest that takes place in the world causes upheaval and it causes madness in the world, but it should not cause upheaval and madness for the people of God. It should not, provoke within us wrong reactions and wrong responses and joining ourselves to organizations or causes, rather, that God would not sanction. And so the hope is at the end of this message you would say, yes, Pastor Frank, we know that, and I'm sure that will be in your heart. But I just want to go through this because not just from one source, not just from two sources, not just from three sources, but from many sources, I have seen what I would only describe as confusion in some circles, in some churches, as to the proper posture to be in during these troublous times, the proper attitudes to espouse, the proper causes to join and not to join, to stay away from. And I won't go into last Sunday's message. I thought was excellent, and as I sat in my seat, I felt a psychological release as the message was going forth, because it just seems like stuff that needed to be said. So you'll understand what I mean when I say, I hope that at the end of the message everyone says, yes, Pastor Frank, we know that. That's wonderful. That would be a wonderful response. But I want to begin with James chapter 1, verse 27. The title of the message is Staying on Message in a Troubled World, for the church to stay on task, to stay on message in a troubled world. In James chapter 1, verse 27, it says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. And we all would agree with that. That seems like the philanthropy that God would endorse. But then it goes on and it says, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Unspotted from the world. Now, up to this point, my interpretation really for that verse had been along the line of sin, right? Not to embrace the sins of the world, not to partake in the sins of the world, but not to be unspotted from the world. But somehow I felt God speaking to me afresh along the lines of this verse and saying, unspotted from the world also means not picking up the offenses of the world, not picking up the causes of the world, not aligning yourselves with the opinions of this world, because they spot our spirits. I want to lay a foundation here. The title of this next section of my message is, By Their Fruits Ye Shall Know Them. This is an unbreakable rule, by the way. It's an unbreakable rule. It is absolutely and without question always the case. It is always true. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 16 and 17 it says, Ye shall know them by their fruits. In other words, what does it produce? What's the fruit of it all? The scriptures tell us that wisdom is justified by her children. Her children, in other words, the fruit that she produces, justify that she was correct, that she was right, that wisdom was right. Ye shall know them by their fruits. And then it gives this illustration here, which I came to appreciate afresh. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. And we would understand that Jesus Christ is the true vine, and so therefore that is the good fruit. But the world produces corrupt fruit. Even when we get into the details of the opinions of this world, it's corrupt. It cannot produce good fruit because its origins are corrupt. If a thistle seed germinates, it will produce what? Thistles. Okay, profound, right? That should be another proverb. But I remember I hated thistles. Many of the areas around my house were fielded areas. And so as a young fellow, as an adult I wouldn't deign to wear shorts, but as a young child I did. Partly because my legs are kind of the color of this paper. But and as a child I ran through the woods or through the fields, and sometimes you'd feel a prick. You'd look down and it'd be drops of blood, smattered all over your calf and your thigh. And it was because, unbeknownst to me, I ran through thistles. And, they were prickly. And then if you stepped on one, I don't like thistles. But never did I go through the field, come up against a thistle, see the drop of blood and say, oh good, there's going to be figs here. Right? Because what does a thistle produce? Thistles. And this is the foundation of what Christ is saying here. Thistles don't produce figs and thorns don't produce grapes. So we always have to go back to origins. We always have to go back to what the spirit behind something is, because that will always produce that fruit. Wisdom is justified of her children because, it's wise, the children that comes forth. So I never looked down at this thistle as my leg was smattered with little drops of blood, expecting to have delicious figs. If I want grapes, I go to a vine. That will take us to John chapter 15, which of course we don't have time for. Well, I got lots of time. Look at that clock. We got plenty of time to go here. Clock is a wee bit off, actually. If I want grapes, I go to a vine. If I want apples, I go to an apple tree. If I want peaches, which I consider to be a fruit that we're probably going to see in heaven, it's so good. Nectarines in particular are good. Then I go to a tree that produces those things. And this is a fundamental truth that we have to always bear in mind. What is the origin? What the world produces, even in sometimes what seems to be a credible cause, is going to be thistles. They will not produce the love and character of Christ. They will produce hate. They will produce division. They will produce things that are prickly. And so every plant produces after its kind. And so the church should not be moving itself with the message of the world, but should be rooted and grounded in Christ and in the Word of God. We can't lose the message in this critical hour. We can't get caught up in causes. Now, when I say we, I'm confident that nobody within these four walls are caught up in these causes. And yet, I keep getting feedback that tells me, and in fact, I read an article, recently. I'm not going to quote the article. I don't want to out anyone or anything like that, or be unkind. But, in this article, if you hadn't told me that it was a Christian magazine, I would have thought it was just a contemporary journalist of the day. And I thought to myself, something really wrong with that. How can we take hold of defense and bitterness of this world and expect to produce peaches and grapes and apples and so forth? The message of Christianity produces good fruit. Now, whether it's liked or not is not the matter, right? That's not the issue at hand. Whether it's embraced or not is not the issue at hand. It is our message. It is the message of Christianity, and we're going to summarize a few significant points to the message of Christianity. But it produces good fruit. Love and forgiveness, but the world's message produces hate and division, and it cannot do otherwise. It can't do otherwise. So when those in the church mix themselves with the offenses and causes of this world, they muddy the waters. They're like a fountain bringing forth both bitter and sweet. And we know that that's, in God's eyes, that's an abomination. But again, reiterating our opening verse, "You shall know them by their fruits." What is it producing? Does it produce love and kindness and the fruits of the Spirit? Or does it produce hate and division? All right, what is the plain and simple message of Christianity? Well, that's the product of whole college courses, and so we're not going to resolve all of that tonight. But let me just give you a few seeds here to drop into your heart. First of all, let me say this concerning the world. And today we're talking about, the guilty and the innocent. But you know what? Before God, all men are guilty. Everyone is guilty. The victim is guilty and the perpetrator is guilty. Unless they come to Christ, all mankind will have the same fate. We can't lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of that. Without Christianity, without Christ, the fate of all men is sealed. All are guilty before God. Romans chapter 3 verse 23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's a fundamental thing. We have to understand that our message is not to go out into the world and to divide, issues in the world. Our message is to convince the world that they're guilty before God and that they need a reconciler. All men are guilty before God. All men are guilty before God. That is the fundamental message of Christianity. And when there's a perversion of that message, then it's lost. That message is lost. By the way, and I'm thinking of very specific people, and of course none of you know who I'm talking about, but because of things that they have said and things that they've posted online, there are some groups of people that are off limits to them now. They will never be able to share the gospel with them. Never. They will never be able to share the gospel with them. Because there are others whose eyes and ears will be completely closed because of embracing the offenses of the world. Romans chapter 3 verse 9 through 18 says, what then? Are we better than they? No, that's not the case. We're all guilty, right? We're all guilty. There's no better than they here. No, in no wise, for we have before proved both Jew and Gentile that they are all under sin, as it is written. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are altogether become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. Now, pay particular attention to verse 13 on. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Does that not accurately describe the climate in America right now? Deceit, lies, bitterness, division, hatred. We can't, as believers, get caught up in such things. We can't. It perverts the message. It dirties the message. Keep yourselves unspotted from the world. Not just the sins of the world, but the causes of the world, the opinions of the world. Don't take sides. All men are guilty before God. All men are guilty before God, and we need to walk with that approach and that understanding in order for us to be effective in conveying the message. Secondly, first was all men are guilty. Secondly, keep His commandments. I have said this in many circles, now literally throughout the world. I've said this in many circles. Deuteronomy chapter 28 was not just for the Jews. Deuteronomy 28 talks about the blessings that will come if you keep His commandments and the curses that will come if you break them. That ignorance to that verse does not exonerate anyone. That's how the world is judged in heaven. That is how blessing and curses are dispensed, if I could say that. I obviously can't read the whole thing, but Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 12 and 13. The Lord shall open unto thee His good treasure. This is for those that keep His commandments. The Lord shall open unto thee His good treasure. When you read this, you begin to realize how false it is for a certain people group to envy another people group. Because this is a blanket blessing. You want God's blessing on your life. You want God's peace on your life. This is the way. You can't legislate peace. You can't legislate blessing. You've got to walk in the commandments. You've got to keep the commandments. And in verse 20, and the whole world, by the way, is governed by this mandate in Deuteronomy. Well, we could go into New Testament thoughts, but I want to keep it brief. The Lord shall open unto thee His good treasure, the heaven to give the rain unto thy land in His season, and to bless all the work of thine hand, and to bless the work of thy hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. And the Lord shall make thee the head, and not the tail. And thou shalt be above only, and thou shalt not be beneath. if that thou hearken unto the commandments of the Lord thy God, which I command thee this day to do and observe them, then you will be the head and not the tail. God reserves these blessings and God reserves these positions for those, that keep His commandments. That's the secret. That's the secret. God takes, I'm just going to share this real quickly. God takes His commandments very, very seriously. 2 years ago, Rebecca and I undertook a prayer meeting. And that purpose of that prayer meeting was to begin to pray about some of the issues in our own lives that we weren't happy with and to really begin to seek God for it. And it wasn't something that we just decided we were going to do. She mentioned it to me and I said, yeah, I've been feeling drawn the same way, and we felt God was in it. And so we were excited because we knew God was going to do something. And so as we began to go through this prayer time, and I was just talking to Pastor Jane the other night about this, as we're going through this prayer time and we're asking God to break certain things in our lives, God began to take me back to my childhood. One day I was sitting in my chair and in a vision, God took me back to something I did when I was 5 or 6 years old. And He said to me, that displeased me. And I repented of it. And there were a series of things over the course of the last 2 years that God began to deal with. And He said, if you want my blessing, then bring this to the light. And I would tell Becky, and I would confess, and I would put things right, and I would seek God, and I put things right. And then one morning I woke up, and God spoke to me and said, your captivity has been turned. You are set free. And it happened as quick as that. All of a sudden things began to change. Now my point is this. It's a testimony of God's goodness and so forth. I understand that. But the thing is this. God cares about what we do. That seems no big revelation, right? And He took me back to what I did when I was 6 years old. And He said, I saw myself. I was oblivious that, this was even a thing. And I remembered the day. I remembered the house that I was in. I remembered the people who were there. I saw them all, things going about in the house. And God said that displeased me. And I felt His displeasure. And when I repented of it, I pleased the heart of God. And through a series of different interactions, God broke something in our lives. Becky and I still to this day, we come to prayer meetings and we are so thankful that God put His finger on things and touched them. Now, many other things that I need to work on, but the point is this. If we don't keep His commandments, I think Danny might have mentioned this, or Pastor Daniel, or his father or son, but the curse causeless does not come. There's always a reason for it. Every curse, there's always a reason for it. And you've got to go back to the origins to fix it. Just very quickly, Deuteronomy 28 says, moreover, all these curses will come upon you if you don't keep my commandments. You want to resolve the issues that exist today, you don't have to go any further than God's commandments. Keep His commandments. And by the way, I want to add this caveat to this. You don't really have to even be saved to be blessed. I know that that's counterproductive to our message here of Christianity, but it was a story was told while I was in college, Bible school, that in France they had observed the laws of the vines going over the wall, the Levitical law, that was for the gleaners. And as a result, God blessed France agriculturally. So, you want to resolve the issues, then stop breaking His commandments. Stop being a criminal. Thirdly, and I'm moving on here quickly. Thirdly, I just want to make sure I don't leave anything out of importance here, because I really I want to make this a clear message. Thirdly, love and forgiveness are at the heart of Christ's doctrine. Love and forgiveness. I've been reading a book recently. It's called Imagine Heaven. And it was a book that some of the people in the book, Pastor Bailey had made reference to in his book on heaven and hell. And so I took that as somewhat of an endorsement. And then so I began to listen to this book. And everybody who has, they call it an NDE, right, a near-death experience. Everyone who has a near-death experience comes back with this understanding The near death meaning they cross over, they see some things on the other side, and then they return to live and tell the story. Pastor Bailey, by the way, also was an NDE, so to speak, because he had died, went to heaven, and came back and told us what he saw. But the thing that is embedded in the heart of everybody who crosses over and comes back, and this truth is so profound in going through this book that it's actually transformed my whole thinking about things. Everybody comes back. If you ask them what the meaning to life is, they all smile and they say the exact same thing: to love. The purpose of life is to learn how to love. Period. Period. That's the end of it. The fundamental part of the Christian doctrine and of Christ's doctrine is to learn how to love. Is to learn how to love. So important, is that message that Christ illustrates to us how shall I say, what a violation unforgiveness is to heaven. What a violation it is. How heaven views it. We're not going to look in there. I'll just give you the verses. We looked at it recently. Matthew chapter 18, verse 23 to 35 tells a story of the steward who wanted to be forgiven of his great debt. And yet, after being forgiven of his great debt, he goes out and throws one of his fellow servants into prison for pennies. So, his $63 million debt, which was equivalent to the entire economy of the British Empire in the 1700s, $63 million was forgiven him. But, the pennies that his fellow servant owed, he wouldn't show mercy. He wouldn't show love. He wouldn't show compassion. And he threw him into prison over pennies. He threw him into prison over pennies. Well, you know what happened to that man? He went to hell. Because a person's forgiveness is based upon their ability to love and forgive others. That's the fundamental part of the Christian message. That's part of the foundation of it all. And so the lesson in this is our burden of debt. On at least one specific occasion, maybe several occasions if I'm honest about it, when God asked me to forgive someone, He reminded me of this. Their debt to you is pennies compared to the heavy weight that I forgave you, so therefore you must forgive. But all of these NDE people all say the same thing. The purpose of life is to learn how to love. I know myself, when I stood before Jesus, there was a period of commendation, but it all melted away as soon as He addressed an issue in my heart where He wasn't pleased with the way I was treating people. The message of reconciliation. Now, those are three basic fundamentals to Christianity that we can't lose in the days in which we're living. Now, the message of reconciliation. We as believers have been given the message of reconciliation to reconcile a lost world to God, because all men are lost. All men are guilty, are born guilty, and are lost. And so, Christianity, when it begins to mix itself with the message of the world, loses its ability to properly convey the message of reconciliation. As I mentioned, there are some circles that will be closed to an individual if they start picking up the offenses of the world and start promoting them. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 to 19 says, all things are of God, who hath reconciled us to Himself by Jesus Christ, and hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. To wit, that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto Himself, not imputing their trespass unto them, and hath committed unto us the word of reconciliation. Not reconciling necessarily people groups, although that certainly is a part of any ministry, any pastor will tell you. But reconciling all men who are guilty before God to God the Father. I'm not idealistic enough to think that it's going to be accepted by everyone. That's not really the point of the message. The point of the message is, let's stay on task. When the world is up in upheaval, let's remain steady. Let's remain clear as to what our mission is and what our calling is. Let's remain clear. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation. I like what Danny did Sunday. Pastor Dan did Sunday. He said, I'm going to hit the pause button. I like that. In fact, I told Rebecca, I'm going to do that in my life more often. So I'm going to hit the pause button here for a moment. We have all of this. And I just want to lay out one little thing here. Authority has come under fire in the days in which we live. And I just want to touch on authority. What actually do the scriptures say about authority? And this is where we'll wrap it up tonight. What do the scriptures say about authority? Among one of the most insane proposals I've heard probably in my entire life is the proposal to defund the police. I can't believe that would come out of an adult's mouth. But, so, what does the scripture say about authorities, okay? And it's relevant, by the way. It's a very relevant thing. In Romans chapter 13, verse 3-4, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. We need to keep ourselves pure and unspotted from the world. And yes, I have heard Christians chanting, defund the police. Otherwise I wouldn't say this. What a ridiculous statement. If an officer is rogue, let him be investigated, let him be prosecuted. But the authority is there for our protection. They're there to prevent anarchy. That's God's perspective on things. And you know what? They're divinely appointed. Everything, as it was said by a preacher one time, everything from the dog catcher in your local community all the way up to the president are all given divine authority to keep the order, to keep the peace. Our politicians today, they feign solidarity with world causes because they smell power and they want it. And that's the only reason they do that, because no sensible person would endorse them otherwise. But what I'm saying this evening is this. That's not our fight. That's not our battle. I'm not saying that we don't have civic responsibilities. That's not the message at all. I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying don't care. What I'm simply saying is we've got to stay on task. Keep ourselves unspotted from the causes of this world. Keep ourselves unspotted from the messages of this world. Our message is so higher. It's so much higher. I'm closing here. Right? My mother one time, unbeknownst to my father, invited a Kirby vacuum cleaner to come and sell a Kirby at our house. If you knew my father, you know my mother was setting this guy up for failure. But my father says to him as we're going in the house, he said, well, my wife invited you, so I'm going to give you time, but I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to buy anything. And he was as true as his word. But that man said this, and I never forgot it. He goes, oh, Mr. Anderson, you're going to change your mind because this vacuum cleaner sells itself. To which I thought, okay, then just put it in the living room and let's see what happens. But you know something? We have the best message in the world. We don't need to pervert it with, worldly causes. We don't need to justify it. We don't need to apologize for it. I mean, all of the world is guilty before God, and we have this knowledge within us that will save them. We've got to stay on task. We've got to stay on message.